Like I had mentioned before, I know we're getting started early compared to Church of Christ time. But I'll tell you, just in prepping for this week, I was like, that is a lot of content. And you guys know me at this point, I'm pretty long-winded anyway. And I know when I started out the year, like my first class I taught was January 4th. And I was like, I'm so glad that I January 4th, because I only had 3 days worth of content to do. But I actually had a full week's of content today. So it is going to take us a little bit longer. You got a question up on the screen here for us to kind of start out our time together. If you were thinking back, right, I want you to put yourself in the Israelites' shoes, in the Hebrews' shoes. If your people had been enslaved for generations, if you've been enslaved, what would it take for you to believe that, and I did this intentionally, that a God had not forgotten about you? Remember, in the ancient Near East cultures, the idea of gods is not unique. And so that wasn't something that they struggled with. They didn't struggle with, does God exist? It's, which God am I following? So if that was you, what would it take for you to feel like a God had not abandoned you? Miracle. A miracle. Any miracle?
Well, something that me passing an algebra test, something bigger than that.
All right, some sort of miracle. Other thoughts? Look for a memo.
Yeah, something, a little something to let me know that he's there.
Yeah, I got to know that you're there. Something that lets me know you're there. Other thoughts?
Anything that would change the course or direction to the new way, something better.
Yeah, something that changes the status quo, right? Changes what it was. Hugh, do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I would break down the answer to the question in 2 points. Number one, okay, great. You showed me that you haven't forgotten you, but as Jeremy was alluding to, how are you going to help us do something about it?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you this passive? Are you passive? Right? Or are you actually going to be involved? Just a few reminders. Remember, my slides are always available to you right there. There's the link. They'll be on all the other slides as well in the event that we don't get through everything. There's my notes and other research there as well for you. So as we continue, I want to remind us of this. This is a slide that I used last time I taught, that there's a difference in thought. And as we jump into Exodus today, if you've been keeping up with our reading, we're in Exodus now. One of the things that I want to remind you of is this right here, because this is going to come up a lot today, right? As we start unpacking Exodus, my hope is that what you're going to see is not just the history behind it, but you're going to see the story of God that is woven throughout, and in such a way that is so evident when it comes to the repetition, the patterns that happen, right? That the Israelites are going to start thinking about, okay, who is this God? Is this the same God that everyone keeps referring to? So a couple of key concepts real quick before we jump into everything. When we think about Exodus, this is the shift from family to nation. If you think about the end of Genesis, we see Israel in the land of Egypt. And so when you think about Genesis, this is the idea of the creation, promises. God chose a family through Abraham. And so we see that lineage all throughout. But then in Exodus, we see that family become a nation. And it's now about this idea of deliverance, covenant fulfillment. And now it's about a nation that is formed and ruled and led by God. And so big picture, if you think about Genesis explains why Israel exists, Exodus then transitions that to then how are those people redeemed? How are they sanctified? How are they actually set apart from that? And so one of the things that you'll see as we unpack this a little bit more is that this isn't just a religious story. This is not just about, oh, God revealing himself. This is a straight challenge to the world power systems at the time. So when we unpack this, what we're going to see historically, the idea of Pharaoh was viewed as a god, right? Or the intermediary of God for that land of Egypt, right? Of being the son of gods. He's the one then that maintains this order. Pharaoh has everything in order, being the son of gods. And so he's the absolute authority. So I want you to think about that mindset, what the people of Egypt, what the people of Israel thought when they saw Pharaoh and some of the things that end up happening. So Exodus then it shows us that Pharaoh wasn't actually the ultimate power here. His power actually can't preserve. Sorry, that's supposed to be life. I typed too quickly there. And then it's Yahweh alone then that creates, sustains, and redeems. So it's not just an escape story. It's not just this idea of Exodus, Israel leaving Egypt, but it's also God overthrowing what they thought as reality. It's this idea. One of the guys that I listen to, Marty Solomon, phrases it this way. He says it's not just about getting Israel out of Egypt, but it's about getting the Egypt out of Israel. Right? This idea that they've been so accustomed to, this culture that they've been so accustomed to, that your value, your worth is all in what you're producing. You're going to see in Exodus, and as God leads his people out, he is slowly chipping away at that idea. He's slowly chipping away at you've got to produce, you've got to build, you got to do all these things.
Hey, Tom.
Yes, sir.
Going back very quickly to that first slide. And I don't think there's any disagreement, but you just explain it. That if I understand this correctly, did not God promise Abraham not only the promises for his family, but for many nations?
Correct. Yeah.
So why this distinct? Are you talking about just implementing?
Correct.
Plan?
The family of Abraham is not the chosen family, like they're the only ones. It's the family that God chose to work himself through for the salvation of humanity.
Okay.
Right. So yeah. So it's not like they're the only ones or special in that regard, but it's the family that God chose to work through to then bring about Jesus and then the ultimate salvation. But that's a great question, and thanks for pointing that out. Right. One of the things, and again, we're going to hit on this very quickly. I want you to think about East and Western thought. And if you were with us when we talked about ancient issues for contemporary times, and we talked about this idea of in Western thought, right here in the USA, we value rhetoric. We value people that speak really well. We value people that can put together logical arguments, right? That's something that we value. We hold those people in high esteem. But in this case, it's not this idea of theology, right? It's not can you argue and prove your case better. It's instead, God begins not with the law. He doesn't begin with just giving the law. He begins with action. He gives a lot of signs and wonders and deliverance for his people because authority is proven by action in this culture, not by argument. It's not this idea of, oh, let me make a compelling case for who I am and convince you. It's this idea of let me show you who I am. And we see that lived out in Exodus. And so again, this will come up towards the tail end. Some of the things that we see God doing in this time period, the Israelites are familiar with it. It's not something that God made up, but he actually sets up the covenant is actually very similar. It parallels how treaties were done at the time, right? When there was a stronger party and a weaker party, there were some things that had to happen when you wanted to have a treaty with one another. And so you'll see that. The key phrase here, it's a suzerain vassal covenant, if you want to do your own research there. But what you see is when an ancient covenant is established, a peace treaty is established, it always starts out with the history of what the king or what the greater power has done, right? This is what the greater power has done. And so because of that, these are the things that we're obligated to. And then in order to seal that covenant, there's some oath and some ritual, and then there's a listing of blessings and curses. And again, I'll kind of show as we unpack that today where that shows up in Exodus, and then as we continue on, you'll see it echo in Leviticus and all of these other things that we study. So kicking us off, then if you're an Israelite, what would you need to see God do, right? Think about our first question, and thinking about all of these things we just discussed. What would you need to see God do before you trusted that he was your king? Again, the idea of gods is not unique, wasn't special. There's plenty of gods. They lived under plenty of gods in the land of Egypt. What would you need Yahweh, Jehovah, to do before you trusted that he was your true king.
You would need to see him do a sign or a wonder that the other little gods could not overcome.
Yeah. Are you the stronger God? Okay. And I think we'll see some of that as we unpack today, right? Am I able to be stronger than some of these other gods?
How about just the belief in, a monotheistic view of God? He's the only one
Right.
versus multiple polytheists.
Right. Yeah. Polytheism was big back then.
Yeah.
And this idea of like, we were just kind of passive bystanders to whatever the gods were doing instead of a very personal and relational God that we see in Yahweh. All right, so as promised every single time, don't worry if you haven't kept up to reading because life happens. I understand life happens. I had to read several days in a row this past week because life happens. So I want to give you a summary, a big picture summary of the events before we unpack it, right? Again, the vision being, and I want to make sure that I reiterate this every single week, is that if you've not kept up with reading, no problem. We're going to summarize it real quick. And my hope is that you start with today's reading and then carry forward, right? As part of that support that we have together is we're going to talk about the reading. We're going to talk about this week. And then don't try to go back and get caught up. Let's go and just start with today and carry forward. So as we look at this past week, it starts in Exodus. And so we see this idea of a rise of a new Pharaoh, right? Israel has been in Egypt. They've been oppressed. And now they're going to be called out. So Moses is born. He flees out of Egypt. God calls out to Moses, and then we kind of see some encounters with God. From there, we get the plagues. So we see how the plagues start to take apart some of the things that are happening in Israel, and they escalate. When we think about what happens, they escalate, ultimately resulting in the death of the firstborn. Then we get to this point with the Exodus, and we see this phrase here that we'll unpack just a little bit, is this idea of the Egyptians began to look favorably upon the Israelites. Israelites take a little bit of a detour, right? So they don't just leave straight out of Egypt and go straight to the promised land. They kind of wander for a little bit, and then finally they escape through the Red Sea. Once they get through the Red Sea, they've seen the power of God. Then they come into a few different instances. There's bitter water. There's this idea of food with manna and quail. They get water from a rock. There's a battle which ensues with the Amalekites. And then we get a little bit of a snippet when Moses' father-in-law shows up and gives some wisdom and some advice. And then at the tail end of our reading this week, we had the 10 Commandments given, and then the first few laws, the first few things related to how do I set up altars? How do I treat slaves? How do I deal with personal injury and property? So if you didn't get a chance to read this week, this is really all that you missed, and we're going to take a little bit of time to unpack each of these, right? We're going to take a little bit of time to unpack each of these. And I promise that each one of these could be an hour lesson in and of themselves. So I'm sorry that we won't be able to go into some detail for some things. But starting out, let's start with that first one, right? This idea at the beginning of Exodus is the oppression of the Israelites. And so my first question, when you think about Exodus 1, so if you're following along, so we're looking at February 1, right? What does Exodus 1 start with? What does Exodus 1 start with?
Burning bush.
Oh, before the burning bush, even before the burning bush. How does the actual book of Exodus start?
It says who the sons of Israel were.
It's a genealogy.
A genealogy, how many there were there, and it references Joseph.
Right. It gives us genealogy, gives the sons of Israel, right, as a genealogy. Why would this be important to the very first hearers of this story?
Well, it connects for them because they've been telling, that was one of the things they did is they told the story of their families. And so, and Moses wrote this for them so that they could remember and remember how they got to Egypt.
Right. Remember, right? Whenever we see a genealogy, it's about remembrance. What else?
Also, the fact that they were fruitful and multiplied, all like rabbits.
Right. It's a reminder, right, of how far God has brought them. These were the sons of Israel, and look at how big we are.
It started
now.
out with 70, and then by the time the Pharaoh's in power, good gracious, there's so many people, I don't even know what to do with them.
Right. So a reminder of God's provision, a reminder of where they came from. Sam.
Yeah, they progressed from guests of Egypt to slaves.
Yeah. So
They're headed down here.
yeah. So you see this progression of we were guests, right? Pharaoh used to be very hospitable towards us. And what happened? Okay, one of the things that I would also argue for us when we think about the purposes of genealogies and why this would be in place is something similar to this right here.
Awesome.
Every single time you see this, what do you know? It's Star Wars. Why?
Because it's kind of an iconic way of starting every movie.
It's iconic, right? It's something you remember or have heard before. I would also say that it gives authority to the movie. If I see this opening crawl title screen, I know it's a Star Wars movie. I know it's part of the Star Wars universe. I know I'm going to hear a Star Wars story. So not only is a genealogy going to help the Israelites to remember, but it also establishes credibility and authority for the story. Because a lot of the times, like they didn't have Google, they didn't have databases, they didn't have any of this other things. They had verbal tradition. And by naming people in genealogies, I want you to think back to when we talked about Genesis. A lot of those people are still alive. And so they can chase it down to build credibility. Hey, was this really your dad? Was this really your dad? Did that really happen? Because that's how their history was passed along. That's how credibility was established in this time period. So hearing a genealogy at the very beginning helps the Israelites know that this is the same covenant story that we've been hearing about. Right? The same God that created a covenant with Abraham before we went into Egypt, this is the same God that we're going to be hearing about in this story. So it's not a reboot, it's not a separate thing, it's a continuation of the story. And so that's the first thing that we do is we establish this credibility. Now, we see in chapter 1, verse 8, this phrase of there's a new Pharaoh. Eventually, a new king came to power. And a lot of researchers, when they looked at it, would say that the phrasing there is actually similar to an actual dynasty change. So it's not someone necessarily who is of the same lineage of the existing Pharaoh at the time, but there was an actual dynastic change which occurred. And so you think about it, if somebody has come in and taken power that is not of that original family of pharaohs, one of the first things that they're going to want to make sure that they do is I got to make sure I've got control over my new dominion, right? I got to make sure I've now taken power, and now I've got to make sure, which then starts to make sense as to why, like Stan was saying, why the view of the Israelites might have shifted a little bit. Because you see this vast group of people, I've come to power. And so now it becomes not just this idea of, I don't like the Israelite people because of racism, cultural differences, anything like that. It's this idea of I'm exerting just political, what good political leaders would do at that time, and establish and make sure that I am secure in my power. So as we then continue, I'm going to ask you to look closely between Exodus 1:1, the very first verse, and then 2:10, chapter 2, verse 10. I want you to look closely. What do you notice about the characters that are mentioned during that portion?
I know it speaks of women more.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head that I was trying to get to. Again, culturally, when we think about it, when women are mentioned in this ancient text, we pause, right? Because culturally, they're a little bit different. They're not viewed as the same stature. Their testimony doesn't carry as much weight as a man's testimony. And yet Moses saw fit that within this first chapter and first chapter in a few verses, the main characters that are mentioned are women. We see it with the midwives that refuse to bend the knee to Pharaoh and what he says to do. Right? We see it in Moses' mother, Moses' sister, Pharaoh's daughter. I would again put before you that what Moses and God is trying to tell us through this is even through the midst of all that is happening, that Pharaoh's power is already starting to come undone in a way that we wouldn't have even anticipated. Right? This is God working. He's reminding us, this is God at work through channels and avenues that we wouldn't see normally. Right? It's not an army that's coming in. He's starting to get undercut by two midwives that have no power, no authority. He starts to get undercut by a woman who acts out on faith and puts her son in the river, right, with his own daughter. And so we start to see his grip start to come undone with that. Now, there's a phrase in here that I want us to take a closer look at. So in chapter 2, verse 2, and the NLT, I think, doesn't do it justice. It says, she saw that he was a special baby. They kept him hidden for 3 months. So if you look at the word that is actually used there, the Hebrew word, it's this word tov. The word tov means good. And again, I'm going to take us back to part of culturally, the Hebrews. It's this idea of repetition, pattern. That's how we know that the story is true. Where else have we seen this word tov come up? In creation. God saw it was tov. It was good. Again, as an Israelite hearing this, as a Hebrew hearing this, I'm like, wait. There's a parallel here. I'm hearing this repetition. And so this is a story of God recreating again. Right? And again, we're going to unpack that. When we see a lot of these things, the separations of the water, dry ground appearing, like this is what is happening in this story. Now we get into Moses. Moses is put into the river. He's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. So he's Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, and then later on he flees to Midian. And he lives in Midian for a number of years. Was it like 40 years or so? So I want you to put yourself in Moses' seat for a moment. How do you think that influences him?
I want to point out one thing. His mother nursed him until she weaned him, and probably until he was about 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So she had time to teach him
Right.
Hebrew stuff.
Right. So he does know his lineage. I mean, to the point where, I mean, he recognizes his people and he acts on it, right? When he sees the Egyptians striking the Hebrew slave, right? So there is a connection, right? There is a connection for Moses. But what else? How else do you think that this impacts him?
I think I'm sorry, I'm talking to you, but he got a lot of, because he was Egyptian and by the princess, he had education that he would not have had if he'd stayed with his parents.
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of understanding of the Egyptian culture. He was educating, and so God was preparing him to be a leader.
Right. Access to probably the best education that you could have, right? Raised in the household of Pharaoh.
I think at some point, I don't know when, maybe the scripture is more accurate than my memory, of course it is, but he comes to this realization that this is not just coincidence that I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Hebrew by birth. You know, we were enslaved people, yet I'm in this powerful house now, and I've been given this position, much like Joseph.
Mhm.
There's your parallel. And I think he begins to realize, I'm part of something bigger than me.
Mhm.
And then I think he gets it, but realizes it's gonna be very costly. So I think that influences his thinking, because it just can't be coincidental that he's been placed in this position where he has a chance to do something.
Yeah.
For God's greater purpose.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you think Moses, I agree with you on that one, right? Kind of coming to this realization, but do you think Moses struggles with his identity a little bit?
Well, yeah, but if you look at chapter 2, verse 11, he said he went out to where his own people. Okay,
Mhm.
so he didn't, it's kind of like saying if you were, Egyptian, okay, and all of a sudden, when you were 3 years old, you were moved to China,
Mhm.
okay, and you lived there for 40 years, what would you probably forget? Egypt. Exactly. Because, I'm in a new culture, not 2 years later, but 40 years later, 45 years later, I would probably forget my future, my past. But he said his own people, he still had a connection back to them. He claimed to be Hebrew, not
Right.
Egyptian.
Right. Yeah, so he didn't forget,
Right.
even though he was raised in Pharaoh.
God, he was important enough to say, it matters to me that it's my people.
Yeah.
This is my own people.
Yeah.
Connects him back to them.
Yeah.
So he hadn't forgotten, even though he was moved away, he had not forgotten.
Yeah. Well, and Moses finds himself in this weird tension. I very much am Hebrew, but I have all this education of the Egyptians. I am living in the most powerful Egyptian's house. I'm having to reconcile all this. And then I also go run away to Midian, and I live there for several years. And so there's a lot of different things that happen. God then calls out to Moses from the burning bush, and unfortunately, we're not going to have a ton of time to unpack that. But there's some things that God first gives Moses before the plagues, before all the things that happen. God says, I'm going to give you 3 signs to perform for Israel. I'm going to give you 3 signs to perform for Israel. The first one is to say, I want you to throw your staff on the ground, and the staff becomes a serpent. Again, some scholars would say that the serpent was a symbol of political authority. The Pharaoh wore the snake on the headdress, had a staff sometimes that would symbolize that. The snake symbolized political power, right? I'm the political ruler of this. And so I want you to think about that. So I throw down my staff, it becomes a snake, and I am able to pick it up without getting bit. God is establishing himself as I am a political authority in this picture as well. And again, we see this lived out with the magicians later on. What is Moses' staff able to do to the magician's staffs? It eats it up, right? This is the king. This is the king, the ultimate king that is able to consume the others. Moses said, hey, put your hand inside your cloak, pull it out, it'll become leprous, and then it's restored again. So God has now established not only my political authority, but I have authority over life and you humans, right? I not only have this political power, am I a powerful God, but I have the very power to create disease and restore, right? I have authority over the human body, over life. And then the last one, take some water from the Nile and throw it on the ground, and it becomes blood. For the Egyptians, the Nile was the life bed, right? Fertility, everything came from the Nile. And blood is a symbol of death. And so what we see now is not only does God have political authority, not only does he have authority over life, over human bodies, but he has ultimate cosmic authority where the very symbol of life, I have control over, to the point where that water will become blood at my calling. So, one of the things that I'd want to ask is, why do you think Moses still hesitated and protested even after all of this?
I think it's that tension that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was gone for a long time.
Say that again.
He was gone from Egypt for a long period of time, it's kind of like, I'm going away for 45 years. Oh, remember me?
Mhm.
Everybody had moved on.
Yeah.
My life had moved on. Remember that guy from 45 years ago? Remember he got that? No, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And there's another Pharaoh in place. If you look closely at it, everyone that wanted Moses dead after he killed the Egyptians has died. There's another Pharaoh that is in place as well. In case you have your hand up.
He didn't have a full trust in God because he kept questioning, I can't speak properly. They're not gonna trust me. And as you see him go on through his miracles, the miracles of God, he started to gain more faith in himself and faith in God.
Yeah.
And he stopped questioning, is God gonna do this? No, he knew this is what's gonna happen.
Absolutely.
He's also worried about, he's worried about being able to convey this and to be persuasive. Because he feels like his words get tangled up and he's not, he's uncomfortable with that.
Yeah. So here's what's interesting. I do want to spend a little bit of time here, and thank you, Linda, for setting this up. Because I think we come to this point a lot where we say, well, Moses says, I'm not eloquent of speech. Right? But yet, if you look at later on in the New Testament, in Hebrews and everything else, it actually talks about Moses being a good speaker. But yet Moses himself says, I'm not eloquent of speech. And later on, he actually uses an interesting phrase. So if you go to Exodus 6, verse 12, if you're following along in this Bible, it's page 132, right? The chronological. He says, but Lord, Moses objected, my own people won't listen to me anymore. How can I expect Pharaoh to listen? I am a clumsy speaker. The words there, if you unpack it a little bit more, because again, sometimes we lose things in the NLT, but if you look at the original word there, what Moses actually says is, I have uncircumcised lips. That's weird. That's a weird word choice, right? What was this idea of circumcision, and what did it mean to the people?
Covenant.
It was covenant. It was an external sign of the covenant, right? This is how you'll know. This is how you are marked as my people. And yet Moses uses that phrase that I have uncircumcised lips. That's weird. And to how to help us unpack this a little bit more, I'm going to take us to another weird story that I think sometimes we gloss over, and that's over in Exodus chapter 4. So a couple chapters before this. Just one page back on page 130, if you're following along in the chronological. In Exodus 4, verse 24 through 26. So this is after God has called Moses. He's on his way. God has chosen him. Here's your signs. Here's all the things you got to do. And then in 24, on the way to Egypt, at the place where Moses and his family had stopped for the night, the Lord confronted him and was about to kill him. Well, wait, God, I got a problem with this. God just chose him. God just told him to do all this stuff. And then God says, I was about to kill him. But Moses' wife, Zipporah, took a flint knife and circumcised her son. She touched his feet with a foreskin and said, now you are a bridegroom of blood to me. When she said a bridegroom of blood, she is referring to the circumcision. After that, the Lord left him alone. So again, I think sometimes we kind of gloss over, like, okay, that's a weird story, but whatever. But I want you to think about, again, we know Moses, he's Hebrew by birth. He's Egyptian by upbringing. He's a Midianite by marriage. He's living kind of in this, what some people call a third culture. Right? He's kind of a blend of all of these different cultures. And I would put forth to you that, is it possible that he struggled a little bit with identity? Yes, he knew he was Hebrew. Yes, but where do I fit in all this? To the point where his own son is not circumcised. His own son doesn't bear the mark of the covenant. And I think that's where God says, well, look, if you're going to do this, you got to be all in. And so I would argue that when Moses uses the phrase, but I'm of uncircumcised lips, it's this idea of, God, I don't even know for sure, right? My own family hasn't completely done what's needed to do when he argues this. Stan, you had a comment? Right. Right. I left. I'm in Midian. I'm living a pretty comfortable life.
And he's married, got kids.
Married, kids. And yet again, even though I know I'm Hebrew, my own family didn't bear the mark of the covenant, right? And we see God kind of following through with this. So again, it's this tension. Like I always go back to like, could we have thought of a better person for God to have chosen? Understands fully Hebrew, is fully Hebrew, but understands the Egyptian culture, all the things, fully equipped. God has given him the signs. And yet Moses still struggled a little bit with, oh, am I though? Because I speak with uncircumcised lips. I'm not a Hebrew, right? I'm not that person. Am I? Like, I'm not, yeah, I'm Hebrew, but I'm not. I'll tell you, I relate with this quite a bit, and I tell this story a lot, right? I was born in Thailand as Thai, like, but as far as culturally, like we left when I was 18 months old. So I frequently, I'm like, yeah, I'm Thai, but I'm not Thai, right? Like, mom would say the same thing. Right, very much. I grew up here, right? My formative years are here, right? Very much my mindset is here. And I would imagine that Moses could probably feel very similarly, could know his heritage, could value his heritage as I do, but still like, ooh, but am I though? Am I really the right person here? So then we get into the plagues and the Passover, and the same question comes up again. How would you tell which God was truly supreme? Well, I know that I'm living in a world that values multiple gods. And so we see here that God attacks what some would say, and it's not a one for one, so don't take it too far here. It's not a one for one, but there are some scholars that would say several of the plagues flew in the face of the deities of the time. I'll give you a few examples of this, right? So the Nile turning to blood, that was the Egyptian god, I'm going to butcher this, Hapi, Hapi, right? Who was the god of fertility in life. So again, very similar to before with the sign of Moses using his hand with leprosy. This is now a sign to the Egyptians against your belief system, saying, your God that oversees the Nile, guess what? My God's bigger than that. The frogs, right? You think all these frogs? The Egyptian god Haket, Hequet. Haket was also a god that symbolized life and fertility, right? So again, happy things. And that becomes a nuisance to the Egyptian people, right? Get rid of these frogs when, and a lot, it symbolized a deity for them. Striking the cattle, right? Apis the bull, Hathor, also used a lot of like cow imagery. So it symbolized strength and prosperity. And so this was a strike against their very economic prosperity. Again, I can go on and on. The last one of which, probably the biggest one for them, is darkness, right? Darkness for them, well, light comes from the sun, right? The sun god Ra. Pharaoh is believed to be the son of Ra, right? So the entire world turns, the sun rises and sets at the word of Ra. And if Pharaoh can't control that, right? If Ra is the ultimate light god, and all of a sudden it's like darkness falls, except where? In the land of Goshen, where the Israelites are. So not only is it this God, right? Because Pharaoh says in there, one of the phrases he says is, who is this God? I don't know Yahweh, right? He's not questioning the existence of God. He's like, I don't know the God that you're referring to. I know Ra, I know Haket, I know some of these other ones. I don't know the one that you're talking about, Moses. And so he's also wanting to know, fine, another God can exist. Another God can exist. That's fine. But can he be precise with what he does? Because it's one thing, okay, I'm going to wipe out everything. But he doesn't. In every single case, Goshen is spared. Whoa. So not only do you have this God that exists that I don't know about, but he cares enough for this people. He's able to be precise enough that he sets them apart from this. All right. One of the questions I always ask is, why not just start with Passover? Why did it take all of those plagues? What do you think?
So I noticed the pattern of basically so that the earth will know, or so you may know that there is this Lord, and it just kind of kept repeating that idea that the, every plague was so that we would know his
Mhm.
sovereignty, his power.
Right? So that we would know. I want you a little bit closer. What else? Not that so Israel would know.
Egypt, the whole
So
world.
Egypt, so Pharaoh, right? I think sometimes again in our reading of the Bible, we're like, oh, Pharaoh's the villain, he's the bad guy. Look at what's happening. But I would again challenge us to look a little bit closer and say, God through Moses saying, I also want Pharaoh to know, so that Egypt would know. It's not necessarily a statement of power and wrath, right? But Pharaoh himself said, I don't know this God that you're talking about. And could it be, right, just a question to think about and reflect on, could it be that the same God that is trying to pull Israel is also trying to win over the heart of Pharaoh so that Pharaoh would know?
I think God hardened Pharaoh's heart,
Right.
just so he could do more plagues,
Right.
just so he could show his power.
Mhm.
Maybe that sometimes in our life, we go through terrible stuff just to be an example of God's hand in our life when we are rescued or when we're not rescued. God is in charge. And that's why I think that's why it used to bother me when he said he hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, that sounds mean.
Yeah.
God can do anything. He can make you say no. He
Right.
could have made him say yes. So, but I think God did this specifically to demonstrate his power through all these plagues.
Yeah, to leave no doubt at all. Beth, and then you.
Also helps that, it helped to destroy Egypt and their economic prosperity. It had an effect upon the Egyptians, not just Pharaoh, and they're like, okay, we are favorably disposed to you, take our stuff.
Yeah.
And it ruined them.
Yeah, so it wasn't just Pharaoh, right? It's the people as well.
Well, this is part of it either. Rachel spotted this before I did in this week's reading, but what is it with the plague of the flies or the gnats? It was the first time that the Egyptian magicians could not duplicate
Yep.
what Moses was doing.
Yep.
And I found that striking. I've read that at least 10 times before and was never able to pick it out until we talked about it and read about it this week. And I said, well, maybe that has a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
He wants you to push through. Now I've got another miracle that not even the magicians can do.
Right. Again, I'll go back to what Tim said earlier, to remove all doubt, right? To remove all doubt. It's not just, oh, maybe it was coincidence, right? Oh, my magicians could do it. But yeah, so you start seeing as those plagues escalate, those magicians can't replicate to the point where they throw up their hands like, this is for real. This is for real. All right, again, I'm going to keep us moving because there's a lot of content. We've only got a few more minutes. So after the plagues, we get this concept of the Passover. And one of the first things God does is he says, this marks the start of your calendar. This starts the mark of your calendar. Again, culturally, right, for the time, new kings would reset calendars to mark new eras, new reigns. Like, this is now your calendar. So God, again, is working in a way that the people understand. He resets their calendar completely. This is God saying, I am your king now. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, salvation still required Israel to take some action, right? God has been working through all of these plagues, but at the end of the day, during the Passover, you had to do something, right? You had to take action. You had to kill the goat, the calf. You had to smear the blood. And so it was a sign that it was a sign of the covenant. All right, so if you believe the gods protecting your nation had failed, right? So for the Egyptians, for Pharaoh, if you saw your gods fail over and over again, how'd that change the way you treated the people their God protected? It goes back to this word. God caused the Egyptians to look favorably upon them, right? That word there, it's not just oh, I like you, right? But this is an acknowledgement of surrender and victory, right? So it's not that Egyptians looked favorably, all of a sudden they liked them. It's they came to this realization, we have lost. our Pharaoh, our kings, our gods have completely lost here. And so it's this idea of the Egyptians paying tribute, right? Here, take what you want, because we are completely destroyed here. And then we get into this detour. This detour. They don't just leave and go straight to the Red Sea. They don't leave and go straight to the Promised Land. God allows them to meander a little bit. And then he says, hey, I want you to camp between these places in the sea. God allows them and puts them in a position where Pharaoh says, oh no, I'm going after them. I'm going to chase after them. They're completely stuck, right? So again, this idea that God is trying to reveal himself even to Pharaoh. Again, I'm sorry, I know I'm going quick through this. I told you there was a lot of content. But I do want to spend some time here. What do you notice about what was guiding the Israelites by day or by night? Clouds and fire. Jesus, in some cases, right? So, the Spirit, right?
And also, a little deeper on that, as the cloud, God hovered over the tent and he lived among the people.
Mm-hmm.
Emmanuel,
God
God with us.
Right.
The Holy Spirit, Jesus sent, God with us, once again, with the people.
Yeah. Again, and I love, Ronnie, that you said it, because this is a reminder to us. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, right? The God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. It's not some new thing, right? The Holy Spirit is not this new thing. But we see this imagery of a cloud or smoke or fire. Where else have we seen this imagery?
During creation.
During creation, you see it. At Sinai, which comes a little bit later. Do y'all remember the first time that God sets up the covenant with Abraham? Right? He says, this is what we're going to do. And then he has them split the doves, right? He has them do this ceremony in Genesis where you split these animals in half and they do what's called walking the blood path, right? It's sealing this covenant. But the way the covenant would normally be sealed is back to suzerain and vassal covenants. The greater party and the lesser party would walk through together, right? And the symbolism behind that covenant is, may I be like these animals if I don't fulfill my part of the covenant, right? That's the imagery of that covenant language. It's if I don't fulfill my part, may it be done to me as we've done to these animals. Well, Abraham doesn't walk through it, right? Because he's like, there's no way I can fulfill my part. But what does go through those? A fire pot, a smoking fire pot, right? And fire, right? God walks through the covenant twice. He bears the responsibility regardless of that. And again, going back to how do I know this is the same story? It's the same imagery over and over again. Israel knows, oh yeah, this was the same covenant and God is revealing himself to the point where he then moves, right? The covenant moves with them. Again, we see the splitting of the Red Sea. Where else have we seen God separate water? Creation. God separates, then he fills, right? So the chaos is restrained, right? We talked about this a few weeks ago. This God that is able to restrain and say enough. He sets boundaries because he loves us. So God separates the chaos, dry land appears, and then life becomes possible through that path. Again, mirroring that same creation story for the Israelites to be able to see. All right, so a few things as it relates to the tests that they were under. So we see this raw people coming out of Egypt, right? God has delivered them, but I don't really still know you, God. And so God puts them through a series of tests, not to see if they would fail or not, but it's this idea of training them up. Can I train up these people so that they would know me, that they would love me? Because they're going to be my covenant people through which I'm going to save the world. So can I win them over? So question for the group. First test is bitter water at Marah. So why do you think God brings Israel to bitter water instead of no water?
Life is not all smiles.
Life is not all smiles. What are we going to do when life after salvation is hard? I have saved you, but now it's not easy. Here's some bitter water that you can't really drink. You're not going to be able to live off of it. But when you read, Moses does something. He throws a log into the water, but where does the log come from? Comes from a tree. Thanks, Tim. Page 146, right? Actually, might be one page back.
What chapter and verse?
So we're going to be at Exodus probably 15 here. 15 around 23, 24, 25. God revealed it to him, right? Can you follow through even with the most ridiculous thing that I ask you to do one time, right? So it's about trusting what God reveals. From there, we get manna and quail. So if Mara was a one-time act of obedience, God is going to up the ante and train his people up a little bit more. Okay, you followed me once, Moses. You believed me once. Now, are you able to handle this daily? Can you trust me daily to the point where if you keep any extra, it's going to rot? Except right before the Sabbath, right? Because I want to make sure that you're right. And then we actually see the Israelites testing God. Up until this point, God is testing his people. And then the last thing, like this is kind of a red flag, the people of Israel start to test God. And yet God still provides for them. And so when we see the battle with the Amalekites, we see, again, a changing of their worldview. They're coming out of Egypt, and they're used to this Egyptian all-unified power in Pharaoh that is able to rule unilaterally. But now we see Moses relying on God for the victory. We see Aaron and Hur supporting, so this idea of shared leadership to each other, and then Joshua taking action.
But, you know, one of the things that I see in this song is that, you know, and I don't, faith is not a switch. It goes off and on.
Right.
And so God is continuing, you know, as their faith grows weak, it's like, look, trust me, I'm still here.
Right.
I'm still going to take care of you.
Yep. Absolutely.
The next time that faith starts to fade a little bit, I'm going to take care of you. I am still here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so over time that can build a stronger foundation.
Yep. And it's exactly what God is after this whole time. I'm going to grow your faith a little bit more to build that foundation.
Get to there, I just want to say that go read Psalm 78 because it's basically talking about all of this that we just discussed in Psalm form, and it just talks about what God did.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it gives it kind of that more poetic, I'd say almost more poetic picture. So real quick, this is the last thing before we get going today, and I know I'm right at the tail end of time. So the Ten Commandments weren't just about rules or laws, and the first things that came after that wasn't just about that. It is this idea of the covenant, right? So the very first thing that happens in Exodus 20, right before the Ten Commandments are given, we see this structure, right? So we start the covenant structure of who's the greater party, what's the history behind them, what are the stipulations, and this is what we see. God says in Exodus 20, I am the Lord your God. He identifies himself. The prologue to this, again, just like they're used to with their covenants, their treaties, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. This is who I am. This is what I've done. Because of that, here's the stipulations to our covenant. This is how a holy people should live. After this, there's some application. What does this look like in everyday life? Well, this is how you treat your slaves. This is how you build your altars. This is what it looks like in everyday life. And then later on, we haven't gotten there yet, but the ratification of the covenant, right, being able to do that is done through sacrifices that we'll see later on in this week's reading. So my challenge to us is to remember that the same God who led Israel out of Egypt is still teaching his people to live in a free world today, right? I'm going to go back to that phrase that Marty Solomon used. Not only did God want to get Israel out of Egypt, he wanted to get Egypt out of his people. And I'd say probably that he's doing that with us today. We live in a world, in a culture in which our value is defined a certain way by the world. And I think just like in Exodus, God is calling us to the same thing. Is, will you trust me with everything that you are? Not just one time, but multiple times. Like Brad was saying, this faith is a journey. And we see that rhyming over and over again. So if you want to dig deeper, again, in our last time here, you can get my resources. The slides are hit there. I'll leave them up at the end if you want them. But we'll pray, and then we'll be dismissed for today. God, thank you so much for this time that we get to open your word together. And thank you for putting your word in front of us, for us to dig deeper, to look closer, so that we can know who you are. Pray, Lord, that you would open our eyes as we read, show us who you are, remind us of who you are, so that we can live differently in this world. We love you, and we pray this in your son's name. Amen.
Can I get 1 minute of your time? I didn't get the text on you ahead of time. Hi, Cliff Power here, part of the search team, most of you guys know about it. We did all an update from the search team on our creature search. I can't give very detailed announcements from the stage. One of the reasons for that, I would love to just give you more detail, but our service is publicly broadcast. It's publicly streamed online. We have candidates and families that watch, and I'm very careful on, we want to be very